Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's ReGen Ag Chat. Tonight we are setting our intentions with Stuart Johnson. So I hope everyone's ready for positive thinking for 2023. So Nick, what have you been up to?
Mainly in the last week, I've mainly been planting hedges.
How far have you got?
Well, I worked out last night, actually, we've got 1.7 kilometres to put in, mainly on a FIPL grant, which is amazing. And we had some volunteers here at the weekend who, first time we've had volunteers, and they were really good, like really good. And they loved it. So I'm going to get some more of them. And then, so we all went down to Oxford. This is our big news. We went to the Real Oxford Farming Conference last week, start of last week, or the end of, anyway, a while ago. And it was just
10 days ago.
Yeah, it was 10 days ago. And we just really loved it. Stuart, you must go next time. And we kind of, all the carbon calling team went, didn't we? And we kind of split off in different directions. My highlights were a lady called Kim, forgotten her name, Kim Bell, I think, from the Small Food Bakery. She did a session with Josiah Meldrum from Hodmedod, my hero. Oh, I love him. And they did a session on flour and bread and connecting people in the middle of Nottingham to farmers who were growing the wheat. And then I did a session with Doreen Allen, who's another hero from Ballymaloe, and Dan Saladino from the BBC Food Programme. And it was just a really good 2 days. We did have a flat tire on the way home, but Tim handled it very well. But you turned into a fully fledged hippie.
I did.
And yeah, go on, tell everyone.
Well, I also got some sort of lurgy from it and ended up in bed for about 4 days. So that wasn't a high point. So I went to sessions where I thought I should have gone to. So I went to one on fertilizer crisis and one on herbal leys and soil, and just found them very interesting, but weren't challenging enough. So I then went to one on land whispering, where I listened to a third generation psychic and how he heals land. That was interesting. And I went to some sort of workshopy type thing. So yeah, I sort of went properly Louis Theroux and went amongst it. But what I found really interesting is that lots of people I spoke to really want to connect with farmers and are slightly terrified of talking to farmers. So
what the kind of the hippie, the kind of more
hippies, they are land activists.
Yeah,
they but sort of really want to get and really engaged in future farming systems and future food systems, and a part of that is farmers. And there's this general, how do you connect all of these different people together? And I suppose that's where we know, with a slight degree of self-importance, is we have an important role in terms of that translation piece between communities, I suppose.
Yeah. I think it would have been good to see more farmers there. But I think
it is such a difficult time of year, which is first week of Jan. Everybody's trying to get caught up after a slightly like trying to take more time off over Christmas. And yeah, 2 days. But the online stuff, I haven't really caught up with the online stuff, but there's a lot of content, isn't there? I think there was something like 800 speakers across 10 different streams over 2 days. So it was mad in terms of organisation,
Yeah.
How they pulled it off. I had quite a lot of highlights, but two of the Japanese drummers to begin with were very good.
Made you cry.
They were incredibly emotional. There was something about resonance, and the second one I had just ended up sitting next to someone who was a worm farmer from near me, and that was really good.
And we're going to get her on, aren't we?
Hopefully, yeah. And there's a group of us that went to the Nicole Masters training in November that have set up wormeries, so she's going to come and do some course for us really on how to actually maintain the wormery. So that'll be good. But yeah, and it was just interesting to be with a very different group of people, I suppose. So yeah, but it is this, how do you get, there's like 1,000+ farmers about 500 meters down the road, and how do you get them talking? I know
that's
part of bit.
I
From
know.
Stu as
Yeah,
well.
I know. It's that just got to talk. Everyone needs to talk. Anyway, tonight we are joined by, I called him a young Gabe Brown, but he will be when he's older. So Stuart, we did a meeting in Penrith with Stuart back in October, where we invited 3 farmers to come and tell their stories to an audience in Penrith. And Stuart, first time we met actually that night, wasn't it? And it was really good. And he was surrounded at the end of the night with people asking him questions, because he's a bit of a soil geek. But before we get geeky, Stuart, I want you to, we're going to have a chat about a bit of history and about your farm, and then we'll go a bit into depth into the soil. So can you tell us a bit about you and like a bit of history on your setup at home?
Yeah, I can try. Thank you very much for having us. It's nice to be asked. We are here in Hexham, Northumberland, about 540 acres on a home farm, which is on an AHA tenancy. We also have a 280 acre FBT tenancy about 15-20 minutes up the road. And then we also have 220 acres of conventionally managed annual land from our uncle, who just wants it left as is and done the way it's always been done. So we just sort of run that as he wants. Very much a beef and lamb livestock based business. We grow our own arable, but that's all for self-use. We don't really sell very much unless we have an enormous surplus. Numbers wise, generally we have about 170 breeding cattle, with fluctuation store numbers, about 800 ewes, obviously with the following lambs as well, and then about 150 acres of arable, but that's sort of been coming down over the last few years. It's probably about 100 now, to be honest. Conventionally, traditionally, however you want to word it, we've always been incredibly high input. We used to show a lot of cattle, throw fertilizer everywhere, sprays everywhere, pushing for yield every step of the way. And we were quite successful at it, to be honest with you. We didn't really, it wasn't necessarily that it was not working, it was just, it was getting harder to keep going. So we sort of looked around for different answers and stumbled on this. So it seems to be a nicer way to farm now. So.
And when did you, when was that, when did you start that switch? And what was the kind of catalyst for that switch, or was it just a gradual thing?
It was about 2012. The guy who used to drill for us with a combination drill, so I used to plough and he would follow, and he wasn't there that day, and one of his lads was drilling, and he came and said, you know, just a bit tongue-in-cheek, I don't know why you bother drilling this, ploughing this, because it's so light the land, you'd be better off just min-tilling it or direct drilling it. And that was sort of where it sort of thought, oh well, if I can save a few pounds, I'll have a look at that. So he's actually we tried a Claydon drill because no one else had one, so we ended up having to buy one of those just to sort of experiment with it. So the contractor son did himself out of the job there by telling us to have a go with it, and it seems to work. And then we just sort of went from there, and it snowballs. And truly, most people on you will be aware that once you start, it's like a bit of a rabbit's warren, and you just keep going. So yeah, it was the initial bit, being told I was wasting money, that sort of set on the way, and it was all driven by financial aspirations.
And where did you, so what did you, when you did the drill thing, where did you then go to kind of start trying to learn stuff?
So with the drill, we did the drill. So I think the first 3 years, so from 2012 to 15, we had this Claydon drill, and we just managed it all conventionally still. So loads of fertilizers, loads of, well, not loads of fertilizers. We were always trying to cut them back, but we still gave everything a full application to make sure it grew and we got a good yield off it. Full spray regime. And then it was about that time that it started well. The first year or two was really good. And then the third year we sort of as we moved into some poorer ground, we started to see that they weren't managing it so well and weren't coping. So we started to look at perhaps why that was happening. And essentially, without going into too much detail, it looked like it was the organic matter in the soil that seemed to be holding up the good established, well producing crops compared to the low organic ones. So that was kind of what suddenly started us thinking that maybe we needed to focus more on the soil rather than just production costs and stuff like that. So that sort of spurred us on a bit more in that direction. So I think I seem to remember saying at that meeting, it's still a shameful thing to say. I said to my dad years ago, it was about that 2012 point when he was saying, "Oh, we'll always plough," and I was saying, "Well, it only grows in the top 2 inches, so it doesn't really matter what's going on underneath that or how far down we go or anything." So in my naivety, I was trying to say I guess that was my understanding of it at the time. I was just way off the pace with how much it actually mattered, and hopefully we've improved a lot since then. So, yeah, we understand it a lot better. So,
but at that stage, it was just doing simple organic matter tests or like walking fields, or do you mean it wasn't? You weren't going too out there with testing, were you?
No, we didn't go too wild with testing. We just kept it to at that point we were still doing the regular NPK tests and organic matter in there as well. Did a little bit of tissue testing on leaves, just to sort of experiment with it, but never really followed up on that at the time. So it was kind of, it was the stepping stones to sort of galvanizing it. I think it was that point 2015 when we had a few. I think it was 30 acres out of the 150 were relatively poor. So we sort of said we can't afford to have poor crops, so I either have to go one way or the other, where we're going to look at this and say, right, we're going to do this. I think that was, I referred to that as when I become oh God, Gabe told me what's the word that Gabe Brown uses? Can't remember, it'll come back to me in a minute. Anyway, he says that at some point or another, you've got to decide whether you're actually going to do it or you're going to just keep going the way you are. And we got to that point where we thought, well, this is the point where we need to either decide we're going to do this properly or we're going to just back out and go back to what we were doing. And we thankfully chose the first option, which took a bit of persuading at times, but now we've got there, everyone's pretty comfortable with it. So be intentional. That's what it was.
Yeah. Mm. Mm.
And you mentioned persuading. So who sort of, if you can just talk through who you needed to persuade or how.
Well, within our business, we've got
the dynamics, I suppose.
There's my mother and father, and then my brother and I. I would say that my dad's always been fairly traditional, sort of very good at what he's done, and everything's gone, well. The idea of not putting fertilizer on and sprays has been a bit of a long-winded process. So it's taken a bit of sort of trial and error and sort of proving it works to get it to go. So dad was very traditional, very sort of slightly against it to begin with, probably fairly against it to begin with, but he sort of and then my brother slightly, he's more, he likes it, he enjoys it, and I think he's just slightly more composed in his thinking, whereas I'll just jump in and try something. I think he likes to think it through, and so he's slightly more placid in how he maneuvers through these sort of things. And like I say, I just sort of jump in a little bit like a bull in a china shop and have a go. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, I'll find something else. So it took a long time to get everyone to come under the same wavelength, really.
So when you were kind of reducing your fertilizer or maybe not spraying something, did you find that quite stressful, as in your dad and your brother were kind of keeping a good eye on stuff and you were saying, no, we need to go down this? Was that quite stressful?
I did all the fertilizing and spraying. So I was putting a lot less on than I was telling them I was putting on. So that was how so when it came to the end of the season and everyone was saying, oh, that's done all right with the, the min-till and we've reduced the fertilizer by 10%, we were more like 40%. And everyone sort of was just, yeah, when I finally came clean and said, well, actually reduce things a lot further than I sort of suggested, it it's sort of they were slightly abashed about it, but at the same time, it was good to just prove that it does work. And I mean, I didn't do it everywhere. There was sort of 1 or 2 fields I did that in, and then move in. I wouldn't recommend people did that, but that's the way that sort of here. I think if you can prove something with our team, it follows through. Everyone sort of is happy to go with it. So yeah, so that was a cheeky little thing we did do that paid off in the end.
Were you selling the extra bags of fertilizer down the street to someone else?
Well, we were just slowly building up a pile of fertilizer, and so we used to buy about 70 to 90 tons of fertilizer a year, and over somewhere around 1,000 acre marks what was sort of run over altogether. So we were never colossally high, but it was high really, and we've just sort of, as the time's gone on, we've whittled that right down, but we've just kept building a bit of a buffer up in the shed and then allowing ourselves to not have to buy some. So we kept buying when the price was low. We haven't bought any for 3 years now since the price started jumping. We're just working away at what we've got. So we're not actually buying any fertilizer really.
So that's a massive saving that well, particularly now with the prices, but that's a chunk, isn't it?
And I have to say, it wasn't planned like that. It's just lucky that the price of fertilizer, as our stores kept buffering up, the price of fertilizer suddenly got silly dear, and we were able to just back right out of it and say, well, we'll just not buy any for a while. I mean, I think we used less than 10 tons this year over the whole lot, so we're not completely out of it, but we're reduced by somewhere in the region of 70–80% really from where we were at. So it's either way, we've got enough, so we don't need to buy a lot. So the price goes up, it's not great, but we can manage it, we can work around it, we have very low break-even points on our arable crops. So we might not necessarily have the biggest crops, and I'm not aiming for the biggest, but I'm aiming for the biggest margin. So if we can afford to lose a little bit of yield, or we can afford to, risk's the wrong word, but we can afford to say, well, I don't want to spray that because it hasn't necessarily got an issue now, so I'm just going to leave it. And we can afford that we might, I'm not saying we'd never spray it, we might go back and spray it if it needs it, but generally we don't need to. So we can afford to have those sort of minor indiscretions throughout the growing season because we have such a low break-even point. So.
You mentioned in terms of reducing the nitrogen in spray, so I suppose the how bit. So how did you? I suppose you just didn't put them on. But what else? What other things did you set up in the background to sort of try and reduce the requirement, or I suppose improve the resilience of the crops?
So what we do within our regime, we put on a lot of foliar feeds, which are minusculely cheap compared to the conventional fertilizers, the sort of leaf foliar feeds that we spray on. Generally, it's sort of the fulvic acid humates. What would that other one be? Fish hydrosolate, bit of molasses, and then we do buy in a very small amount of foliar feeds from a company who I've dealt with for quite a few years, but I only put one of those sprays on, and that's in the back end, just because direct drilling doesn't create a huge amount of disturbance, and it's the disturbance that releases the NPKs to sort of stimulate that crop to grow. So I like to just put a little bit of phosphate on in the back end to help the crop sort of get its legs in the ground, as it were. So we put like the double on, but we put that on at about 1/5 of the rate that we're actually meant to put it on, which is sort of a belt and braces approach for now. So we also do compost tea brewing. So we brew up microbes, aerobic ones and anaerobic ones. So the anaerobic ones are good for using everywhere. We put them in the muck midden to help break down the mucks faster. We put them in the straw shed. We use them in lammin pens instead of disinfectant. Someone told me years ago that if you put a disinfectant in, say for lammin pen, it'll kill all the bacteria, and the ones that come back are the bad ones. The ones that come back fastest are the bad ones. So if you put in a good bacteria that's an anaerobic one that can live in those conditions, if you put enough of that down, that'll just help to counterbalance the bad ones that do creep in. So we've used that for the last 2 years, but it's quite successful actually. It's been a good thing. So
can you just, when you say compost tea,
yeah,
can you just break that break that down to the start of the compost tea.
Okay, so this is where it turns a little bit hippie though, because I go.
Well, Liz loves this. She'll probably start crying.
This is not the time to have a go at people's emotion. It's just because I'm emotionally connected and you're not. Sorry, Stuart. It's just between Nick and I.
So this is the sort of thing that I do without telling the rest of the team here. So I did a lot of research on this, and the people I've probably that helped most with this has been Joel Williams and Gravesade. So they're pretty on the money with this sort of stuff. You've got your other people at the other end of the spectrum, like Gabe Brown, who's very much a just don't put anything on. But if you wanted to sort of go down this path, or if you're semi down this path, it's quite nice to have a belt and braces approach where you feel like, well, I'll put it on because it doesn't cost very much, but it's not going to impact negatively if it doesn't work. So so I still use the belt and braces approach, but I am aiming to get to Gabe's point at some point where we're not putting stuff on, we just let it get on. But at the minute, especially within a team of board, just easier sometimes just to keep the peace and make sure that we keep putting it all on. So with compost teas, I go.
Sorry to clarify, but is Gabe he's not putting anything on, so either conventional products or compost teas, is he? He's just allowing.
No, he's not an advocate of them at all. Okay. No, I mean,
so he's basically not applying anything.
No, he came to ours and did the farm tour in October, and I proudly took him to the compost tea brewer, thinking he would be immensely impressed that I was bothering, and he just sort of myself, and I was like, all right. So yeah, he's got to a different level altogether again, and that's where he's at, and hopefully we'll get there at some point. But at the minute, we're still making those steps. So
getting back to the tea, yes. Yeah.
I'll go out into the woods and I will find between an oak tree and a pine tree, because an oak tree is fungally dominated and a pine tree will be bacterially dominated. So I need to find the soil that is somewhere in the middle with about a 1-to-1 ratio. So I'll go in there, dig that up, and then I have a little wormery at home that I just sort of mix up some vermicompost in, or have that coming, and I'll use 30% out of the wood, 30% out of there, out the vermicompost, out the wormery, and then 30% out of the hedgerow, underneath the hedgerow. And that's to then get bacteria that's predominantly acclimatized to my land. You know, bring a compost tea and do it at mine. But what works at mine might not work 5 miles down the road at his, or might not be as beneficial. Really, you want to use your bacteria that's acclimatized and done to your farm. So I'll go to the woods, get my little sample together, put it in a Hessian sack in a big. I've got an old milk tank. I've got a picture actually. If you want me to show you, I've got that. I don't know how to show you a picture of mine.
No, it's quite simple. See on the bottom, you've got share screen. That green one.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Can you see that?
You need to find, yeah.
And then just show your picture, but yeah, your screen's up.
Right. Talking while I'm finding it. So we put all the compost tea bag in there. I'm changing my thing there. We put the compost tea bag in there, and then we'll fill it with water, obviously, and then put in food sources. So the food sources will be, there's a picture of it there.
It's not.
There.
Oh, in the bottom corner.
Bottom
it was,
right.
yeah, but am I going too fast there for your lot to catch up?
No, just
that's it there.
There, okay.
Stop.
Yeah.
Don't press
stop.
anything. Oh, so it's like a proper old milk tanker.
Exactly like an old milk tanker, yeah. So you can buy these things for about £8,000. So I just bought an old milk tanker, like an old milk storage cube, and then bought some pumps off eBay, some old garden pond pumps, and then put some new things on the end, some new pipes on the end, and some new stones. set it all up in there, and then that costs about, I think including the tank, that costs about 450, 500 pounds or something altogether. So I was working on the basis that if it didn't work, it hasn't cost me a huge amount of money. I'd probably still be able to sell everything on again. So we just use that, and then we put it in the tank, aerate it up with the pumps, put the food source in, sorry, aerate it up for 36 hours, and then
Food sources, what are they?
fish hydrosolate helps the fungal side of it. Molasses is a cheap food source for the bacteria. We put in some humates, but they're quite expensive, so I just sort of put the bare minimum in. And then we put in fulvic acid as well, because that's good for, well, everything. So yeah, so that's pretty much, I mean, I've got ratios, I can share them at the end if you want, but it's on my phone. I'd have to dig them out, but I can share them if anyone's interested. But again, this all came from Joel Williams and Graham Sayed, so I've an idea and run with it basically, and it seems to work pretty well.
So you put it in there and it kind of bubbles away, and then how long before you use it, and do you do something to test it?
Yeah, so 24 to 36 hours, and I've got a microscope, so I like to check what the soil's like at the start, so I'll keep a little bit of soil back, and then I can have a look at the soil, see what bacteria and fungal, like what parts are in there, and then once I've got a brew done, I'll take a bit of the liquid that's in the brew and see how it's compared. So essentially what I'm trying to do is brew up within the soil, within that little sample of soil, and they'll multiply up into the billions by the time I come to use it probably. So we'll go and spray that on, and essentially all you do is putting on the base layer. So a lot of people think when you see worms you've got healthy soil, but there's an awful lot of steps before the worms, and this bacteria and baseline fungal stuff is sort of the starting process of it all. So essentially you're just laying down a food source for everything to then tumble up the channel, as it were.
And how are you spraying it on? Are you using a particular adapted sprayer, or what are you using?
No, just a regular sprayer.
So you
just
just
use my regular sprayer, as long as you don't go above I can't remember what the pressure is. It's damaging to the microbes at a certain pressure. Again, I've got it written in my phone there in my notes, but it's a certain pressure that you don't go above, and it tends to just come out all right. We use this so we've replaced the fungicide applications with a compost tea. So essentially we're laying down bacteria on the leaf, and then we find that with doing that and making sure we monitor Brix levels as well. Sorry, I'm probably deviating a little bit here. We monitor Brix levels, and if you keep a Brix level above 12, you don't necessarily, or you don't often have a pest problem. And then if you have a high Brix level and a healthy plant, and then you're spraying these bacteria on the leaf, we've now haven't put fungicides on for 4 years. So we're sort of replacing the need for fungicide by belt and braces on the nutritional side. And someone told me then, again, I'm very good at just listening to what people say and regurgitating it as hopefully my idea or just doing it. But we put the bacteria on the leaf, and if the good bacteria is sitting on the leaf, there's not much room for the bad stuff to get on there, or the fungi to get on there. It's the bad ones. So we've got our good stuff there, which is hopefully just going to outnumber or outperform the bad ones. So we don't tend to get a lot of disease pressure. So it's good.
I think this is incredible, Stuart. So do you know Joel Williams? How did you begin, and how long did it take you to like do it, that it was working and learn it? Because it's just, what do you think, Liz? It's quite.
Yeah, and I suppose, well, in terms of, they've been about, haven't they? But it's also the bit that's interesting is it's at scale, and it's not just someone. You know, I tend to associate them with smaller scale enterprises. While this is doing it's at 1,000-acre type enterprise, isn't it? And
so out of one tank full, I can do 70 acres is what I tend to run at. So I do. No, sorry, that's a lie. I get 2 tankfuls out of it, so I get 150 acres out, which at the minute is, well, for the last few years, has been all my arable ground I can cover in one sort of sitting.
So
and have you tried it on grassland?
Yeah,
do you not
but
think you need it?
Managing the livestock's more important than messing around with stuff on grassland. I think management strategies of livestock is far more rewarding than spending time. Because we don't put any fertilizer on grassland anyway now. So grassland correctly, as in mob grazing it, moving everything around, but also giving it good long rests and not putting synthetic stuff on it. We're finding that the grass just seems to get on by itself now, rather than us having to worry about it.
So financially, if you now aren't using fungicides, roughly how much is that of a saving? Is it? I don't know how much fungicides are.
It varies depending on how high input you are, but I would imagine we've probably spent £60 an acre on fungicides. So yeah,
and this isn't a huge amount of money. I think it doesn't cost much to do this.
It costs about £1 an acre.
So is it for sale? So your neighbouring, well, it wouldn't work though, would it? Because it'd be different.
Well, it wouldn't work, and also you've got the idea that you don't really want to. It's a time window when it's at its best, sort of thing. So you can't bottle it up and send it off or something like that.
Okay.
So it's kind of a.
Well, I was listening to something. Sorry, just briefly at the Real Oxford Real Farmer, and they're associated with the God, I can't even speak. The Soil Food Web initiative, and they are starting to think about like commercializing or producing bottles of stuff they'll send away or send off. But the shelf life is not long.
Well, the shelf life of this stuff will go over the top within a few hours. Because the food source, if they keep multiplying up, the food source will run out, and then it's done, sort of thing.
There's a couple of questions on that, which is, how do you know you're putting on good bacteria, not bad ones? I'm guessing that's
just
the reference.
Just because I compare the base composts that we used to start with, basically. So if it looks, I mean, I'm no microbiologist. I'm a practitioner rather than a scientist. But if it looks similar and the microbes are moving in a similar sort of fashion, I'm pretty comfortable with that. And if I put it on and it doesn't do anything positive, it's only cost me £1 an acre. So I'm not terribly worried about the cost of it. So
there's also a question in terms of, you mentioned you were doing anaerobic and aerobic. So how are you using them different, or how are you using those?
Well, anaerobic is very different because that'll go dormant, so you can't actually bottle that up and put that out for sale. So we buy our anaerobic bacteria, and we get it from. Am I right to say where we get it from? Is that any? We get that from. It's called BAM, Beneficial Anaerobic Microbes. It's Graham Sayett's company, and they are New Generation Agri. I think they sell as over here. They sell BAM, and this is the bit where they won't like it. They sell BAM for about, I'm going to pluck a figure here because I'm not sure if I should say the numbers. I'll say £100 a drum. So if they sell a drum for 20 litres, but you can expand that 20 litres to 400 litres for the cost of peanuts again. So throw that around readily, because it doesn't really cost us very much money at all, that stuff. So we can brew that 20 litres up into 400 litres, and then like I say, we just throw that on everywhere and anywhere, because it's not cost us very much money. And if it doesn't do anything, all that's going to happen is the microbes die, something will eat them, and then that starts that process again, going up the chain. So it's
And do you think, in terms, because it is a very different skill set, isn't it, to what, or interest, or do you mean it is that element of you've got to be interested in it to do it? Most people probably won't get there, or do you think?
Yes and
more
no,
people that are.
I don't want to do this forever. I'm interested in it. I find it fascinating, but my still end goal is to not be doing it. And at the minute, I would suggest we're very much doing it. And this is what Gabe says. You're doing that very much as a belt and braces approach, rather than needing to do that. And I'm comfortable with that for now, but I don't intend to do this forever. And I don't think you necessarily need to. It's the same with the regenerative agriculture in general. I think that if you accept the principles and you work to the principles, you don't necessarily need to know the science behind it. And this is sort of very similar to that. If you brew it up, there's a couple of telltale signs that it's gone wrong. If it smells badly, you know, if it smells like sour or unpleasant, that's a sign that it's brewed badly. So you would just ditch that. So without knowing the science behind it, there is some obvious signs that it's not gone very well. So yeah, so in terms of, like you just said there, do you have to be really into it or really sort of experienced or whatever to do it? I don't think you do. I think you just need to trial and error it. And if as soon as you get to a point you're comfortable, it's costing you so little money to do that it doesn't necessarily matter if it's not doing a huge amount of good or bad, or, you know, it's worth not the risk. The risk is it's worth doing, whether impact or not. So
I would quite like to watch you for the first time going off into the wood with your Hessian sack, finding your 2 trees.
I had to sneak out when no one was looking, because that would have ended the whole conversation on ReGen Ag, I think, if they'd seen that. So
and just one last sort of question on that, which is if you have, so you mentioned your trigger, or you're trying to keep your bricks above 12. So bricks is a measure of sugar, isn't it?
yeah.
Within the plant leaf or tissue, so an extract out of that tissue. So if it is above 12, the point, do you need to apply, the question is, do you need to apply the microbes, or is it actually showing you've already got a healthy, resilient crop there anyway?
If it's above 12, I would generally say it's a pretty healthy plant anyway. You know, it will fluctuate, it will move, but if you've got a low bricks level, you can very quickly fix a bricks level by applying basically humates, fulvic, and there's one more product. Fulvic and humates are the main ones, and there's something else you put in with it, sorry, I can't remember right now. So you can very quickly lift a bricks level, and I would say you're almost better off if you've got a low bricks level and you think you've got a pest problem, to apply again, this company, New Generation Ag, makes a bricks fix, it's called, but they sell it as a bottled, ready to go product. Not bacteria. It's not bacteria. It's just a liquid fertilizer or liquid foliar feed, and they bottled it up as a ready-made to go product. But all I did was just get the 3 raw ingredients and mix it together, sort of thing. So you can very quickly lift a bricks level to get rid of pests. So.
I have put the link to the company in the chat if people are interested. It's the one based in Northern Ireland.
That's the one, yeah. They are. They're all. I mean, there's quite a few companies out there like that. They just happen to be the one that I was dealing with before everyone, the world and his wife, decided to start selling products. It's one of my pet hates with this whole thing, is it's now starting to become commercialized. Because people are now trying to sell snake potions and stuff that will fix everything, when really. So for example, I've got a friend who I showed how to do a lot of this, or I explained. I mean, I just learned from, I have to be honest, there's a guy, a contractor around me who's exceptionally good at this. So 10 years ago, I rang him up out of the blue and said, can I just come and pick your brains? And he was really good with me and said, yeah, come down. And I sat in his office for 3 hours, and he talked me through everything he was doing and how it was working. And that was, I think it must have been 10 years ago, it was 2015. That was the point at which I thought, I've got an awful lot to learn here, and this man knows an awful lot more than me. So I had to go and to understand it. So I essentially started telling my friend about this, and he did it. And then he rang me one day and said, I've got a potion off my agronomist sold me this thing, and it was £14 an acre it cost him. And I said, well, what's it? And he said, oh, he just said it was, I can't remember what he said, but he said, it's not, it's just, you know, what the guy said was a good one. And I said, well, ask him. And he rang the guy and asked him, and it transpired it was humates, fulvic, and all the bits that we put in for about £1 an acre. And then he just sold it to him for £14 an acre. So people are making a lot of money out of this now, and it doesn't need to be, it's complex, but it doesn't need to be complicated or oversold. It's just, if you do a little bit of research and put the raw ingredients in, it's very simple to just do it on a very low budget. So, but like I say, it's one of my pet hates. People keep trying to monetize this, and it doesn't need to be monetized.
So if there was someone out there now who thought this sounds interesting and it might float my boat, what would be your couple of things that they should do first, like where to go or what to read or what to watch?
Oh, well, I did a course with, like I say, Graham Sate. So I did a 2-day course with Graham Sate, and that was the.
How do you spell that? Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
How do you spell Sate?
Sait.
Hmm.
And he's an Australian, well, he's either an Australian that lives in New Zealand or a New Zealand that lives in Australia. And he's been on this for years and years and years and years. So he's really good. And Joel Williams essentially was, I believe, was a student of Graham Sate's. So they're both out the same stable. They just happen to have gone slightly different ways towards it now. But they are a fascinating sort of fascinating to discuss with and talk to. So I did a Graham Sate 2-day course, and I've done maybe 4 half days with Joel Williams, and then I've emailed him an awful lot of times afterwards, really getting my money out of him. So it's good. So
because he's just done a podcast, isn't he, with Michael Blanche, I think.
I believe so. Is that the
Pasture Pod? I haven't listened to it yet. Yeah.
No, I've not. But someone messaged me and said he was really good. He's also doing a 10-week block coming up in the next week or 2. I think he's starting a 10-week block on how to reduce nitrogen usage in a farm.
Yeah, it's it starts on Thursday. I've signed up. Yeah. Course.
It'll be brilliant. It will be really good. So we apply so what we do is we buy bags of urea fertilizer now when we are applying fertilizer. So I've been taking my can back to the man and swapping it for urea, and then we solubilize the urea and spray that on the leaf with the compost teas or foliar feeds and stuff. And when you put nitrogen on by the leaf, you can get away with, well, they sort of suggest sort of 60%, but I've been sort of calculating it more like 80%. I'm using 80% less with the urea foliar feed than I am with the bag, just because there's something to do, and this is again me not really being a scientist, but it's something to do with where if you put it on the ground, it has to go through 3 or 4 processes where it changes its form of nitrogen, and then travels, and then changes again, then travels again up to the leaf, and then it essentially goes back to the original form of nitrogen to be utilized. But if you just spray it straight in the leaf, it doesn't burn up all that energy getting to where it needs to go. So it's on there. So so we do that.
And so just with the courses, typically, what would a course cost? I'm just thinking someone, if it was like £1,000, you might think, oh, that's a lot of money, but then it's probably not, or I don't know what they cost.
I think it was about £300, the Graham Sate 2-day course. It wasn't too silly. And I think Joel Williams is dependent on who's there and how many's going. So I think we've managed to go as a farming conglomerate and get him in a few times, sort of where we all pay a little bit. And he is happy to do that as well. Or we've been when it's been organised by someone else and we've just ridden on the tailcoats for a free ride sort of thing. So there is free. I mean, I think he's been up in the Northeast here probably 6 times in the last 5 years, I think. So because he's Canadian, I believe. So he's not actually over here all the time, but he does come over fairly regularly. So it's worth.
He has a few links in the chat. So the Pasture Pod link, Rich Thomas said about a Graham Sate podcast. So that's also in the chat, and a link to the Graham's company as well.
Oh, is that the Graham Sate nutrition farm? That's brilliant for some intense listening if you're up for it, because he does go into some in-depth stuff, but he's really good, Graham. So yeah.
So we just need. Can I just work through some questions and then I can tick them off the list? Sorry.
Of course, yeah.
So
yeah.
Wendy said, would you be happy with other people using your brew kit? So would you offer it to others, or is it in use? You're using it most of the time?
No, I don't use it. I mean, I'll probably just use it maybe 4 or 5 times a year most. So it's not something you could transport around or anything like that, but it's sort of, it's not an issue to do that. Like if you wanted to, if you were, 3 or 4 of you wanted to buy one together, that's sort of a fairly easy solution to spending to getting kitted up without spending a lot of money, I think.
Emily's still on the Does if you've got a bricks of 12 and you've put some microbes on, does it need the microbes or does it need the humates fulvics?
Does what?
What
Sorry,
do you think?
if it bricks up
Sorry,
to 12.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the follow-on question to what we've dealt with before. So if the bricks of a plant is above 12, you put some you sprayed on some just in case. And then you mentioned within that spray is the fulvics and the humate. Do you think it's difficult to know what it's reacting to? Your point is it's reacting to something. If it doesn't react to it, then it either doesn't need it or it's not right.
Yeah, and it's cost so little. It's for me as an individual farmer, it's not me worth wondering or trying to figure out which one's making the difference, if that makes sense. If I put it on as a blanket treatment, it's not worth me experimenting to see which one's making a difference because it costs so little that I'll just happily put the blanket on every time, safe in the knowledge it's doing what I hope it's doing. So we haven't had much bother with fungicide. Like we haven't sprayed fungicide for 4 years now. So it must be working to a degree, if that makes sense.
I suppose the question is a bit like the challenge from Gabe, which is when do you start to say no, like when do you start putting the blanket on? Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it sounds like everything's going wonderfully. We've had points where we've been hit by pests because the bricks level's been too low. So we're not infallible for making mistakes. And it's not that it's 100% all the time. We've been caught at this back end with them. So after doing this for years, we figured out the best way to do it was to spray off. So we'll happily spray Roundup up. If you put Roundup on, though, usually at 3 litres a hectare is the going rate. We put it on a litre a hectare because we dropped the pH down to 2.8, and then we add fulvic to the mix, and that means that you can get away with 1 litre a hectare. So the damage you're doing when you do use it is far less. So we found the best way for us to spray off was 3 to 4 weeks before drilling, grass field, say. But then this year, because we've been pushed for grass at times with the weather, it was so dry, we held off until the very last minute. But then we found that the fruit fly that live in the grasses all the time, generally, they maneuvered straight from the grass into our wheat and butchered half a field of wheat before we could get our eyes in, sign and get ourselves together to get sprayed on. So we are making mistakes all the time. But what I'm sort of suggesting is that because our inputs are so low, we can afford to have little indiscretions or errors. That's, I've got someone who lives not far from us. I was talking to him. He's a big input man. He has a break-even point on his barley of about 3.6 tons, I think he was saying he needs to hit, which means he's got a colossal amount of inputs going on to that to then just to get to the break-even point. Now, he always gets a huge yield, but what costs that huge yield coming with later down the line? What points do you say, well, we're putting too much stuff on here and damaging the soil too much? So, sorry, I'm probably waffling a bit at you now.
No, it's good. It's good.
And there's just another clarifying question about bricks. Do you do it at the same time every day if you're going to compare fields, and which leaf do you use?
Yes, you should do it at the same time every day, but I don't. Depends on when I'm in the field and when I've got the refractometer with us. So, and I try and use the end tips of the top leaves. Is what I try and use. But that's not to say I'm right. That's just to say that's when I do it. So, the experts would definitely be able to point you in the right direction if you're concerned about when you are doing it. But we generally find it's generally all right most of the time, and don't really worry about it too much till this year.
It will be influenced, won't it, by sunshine? But it's
absolutely,
not gonna, if it's going to be low, if that crop is low, it's likely to be lowish, isn't it, throughout the day, really?
Yeah, but if you go in the morning and it's still 12, you're pretty confident that later on that day that's going to be a lot higher than lower.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So it's not the end of the world, and when you go, as long as you allow that there will be some sort of discrepancy from that point. But again, I think that comes with just doing it. You get maybe a feel for it, and then in terms of, do you worry about it too much? You just go and do it, and then you'll you'll make a decision based on the variables that might go with it. So
just to,
So go on,
sorry,
Liz.
Nick, just are you then, just following on from bricks, are you seeing a higher bricks when the soil organic matter is higher, or do you see that relationship?
yes. Yeah, I can't explain why. Well, I'm assuming that there'll be a very, very logical reason why, but it's definitely a relationship between higher organic matter and healthier soils and a high bricks level.
Just,
In my interpretation so far, anyway. I mean, that's
Okay.
that's my sort of findings.
and just one last question. So moving from arable to livestock in a second, but in terms of, are you getting any premium for your arable at the moment, or your premium is your margins you're getting because your costs are low?
As in when we're selling it, you mean?
Yeah. So are you selling? The question is, are you getting a premium for any of your arable grain outputs, or is it just being sold and tipped with others?
We grow what we feed. So
That's true. You did say that. Sorry.
yeah, we were utilizing about 300 tons of arable per year 7 years ago, say. This year we've only used 100 because we've kind of changed the livestock to suit the system now, rather than. So now we've got to a bit of a conundrum where we're growing arable that we don't need anymore, and then it's that sort of thing of, do we stop growing arable and increase the livestock, or do we grow arable with the intention that we're going to sell it? And I haven't quite decided which way we're going to go yet. So I'd like to think that we would increase the livestock and stop growing arable, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the arable will always outperform monetary livestock. So whether it would be sensible if we just took that, built up our fertility for a few years and then cashed a little bit of that out and then carried on building, that might be a more sensible option, but I haven't quite got my head around which way to go yet with that.
So just on the livestock, talk us through where it was in 2012 and how your grazing and numbers and breeds have changed.
Okay, so 2012, probably similar numbers. Haven't really changed our numbers drastically over the years. We've probably changed the livestock enterprises, but the numbers are probably fairly similar. So 2012, we were heavily feeding a lot of cattle. We used to fill the sheds up every winter to feed them out. Feed out store beast. We used to show a lot of cattle. Like I said, we used to spend a lot of time creeping calves and showing cattle sort of 6 months onwards. Not hugely successful at national level or anything like that, but we used to have a lot of success at the local markets and stuff. So I used to like that. I used to love doing that. But with the livestock, we were finding that when you chase the better carcassed animals and the shapier things, we had 1 year. This would be when we changed the livestock. So the arable, initially, everything in 2012, 2015 was purely arable focused. Didn't really think about the livestock side of things. 15 into 17 probably was when we started really looking at livestock. And I think 17 was probably when we bit the bullet and really pushed on with the livestock side of things. So I think in 17 we had 5 cesareans and two dead cows maybe, and numerous dead calves of a spring calving that went badly. As we chased all these shapy calves and whatnot, and we were making more money per calf sold, but probably less calves sold than we should have by quite a considerable margin. So that was that point about 2017 that we started changing the livestock side of things. So we went to an easy calving Charolais bull. We've now maneuvered cattle. We used to have a lot of 3/4 type cattle, limies out of blues and blues out of limies. We now got cattle that are more like Stabiliser types, native bred in there somewhere, with an easy calving Charolais over them. Last year, I think we had only a handful of dead calves. I mean, you're going to get them every year, but far less than we were getting previously. And I think we probably only calved a dozen out of 170. So the livestock side of things has gone a lot easier now. cattle side of things, sorry. So we're changing the breed of the cattle because as we've gone into mob grazing, we're deferring grazing, so we're shutting grazing up sort of from August onwards, and then we graze that through as late as we can. Last year we got to about the 20th of January and then brought them in, and then we start calving in the middle of February. So they were in for just under a month before they started calving. Then we start turning out again on about the 10th of March. This year with the drought, I didn't think we were going to make it to Christmas, but actually we dragged it right through till the 3rd of January before the cows came in. So we've lost 17 days on last year, but given the summer we had, I'm not too ashamed of that. I think that's gone all right. So the cows are in now, and then, like I said, we'll carve them down next month and then start turning them out. Sheep wise, sorry, I'll go back a step there again. Sorry, I was explaining that because since we started mob grazing, basically what we tried to do was design a system that suited our farm. So with the cattle, I want them outside. The cattle, the killer bit is the wintering. That's when you lose your money on the cattle. So I wanted the cattle that could stay out as long as possible, but still stay fat. So we're now trying to move towards cattle that suit our system rather than picking cattle and then making the system suit them. We've found a system and now want the cattle to fit that. Same with the sheep. So we used to have a lot of dairy bred cows as well, but they can't stand the way that we winter them now, and they don't like it. So we're whittling them down quite quickly now, and we're just replacing them with stabilizers and half-bred stabilizers, which they just live on fresh air, to be honest. So they seem to be a lot more suited to the way we want to do it now. Like I say, the sheep are very similar. Last year we didn't feed any concentrate feed to the sheep. We just mob grazed them on cover crops. This year we've gone slightly different, but we're using the legume and herbal swards. I'm trying to do it on them this year. So rather than having that added cost of drilling a cover crop in and then shutting that field up from, say, July onwards to let it grow, we've done it on GS4s this time, and hopefully we'll have enough to keep us going, but we'll find out in the next month or two. But then hopefully if we can run them on them and cut out that extra drilling cost or exercise, that's again, it's just another saving. So that's what we're trying to do this time.
So just going back to the cows, when they were out grazing in December,
yeah,
you closed those fields up. When were they last? What was your rest period? And is it on old pasture, or must be on old pasture, is it?
So yeah, we've done it. We used to put in cover crops. So 2012, we used to put in cover crops and proudly take photos and videos as cows walked into cover crops and they would just disappear in them. They were so big, but there's no bottom in there to carry them. So the cows would plunge around a lot and make a lot of mess. And actually it was and we used to strip graze then as well. So rather than mob graze, we used to strip graze across the field, in incremental moves a day. And that actually, as much as the cover crop would have done some good, the cows plodging around and walking back and forwards all the time probably did more damage than the cover crop did good. So we shifted that slightly to mob grazing over cover crops, and that worked a lot better. But I still had the cost of the cover crop and the time of the cover crop, shall we say, that went into it. But also, when I was talking to some of the better known men than myself, they were saying that it's not the plant itself that's going to hold the animal or the soil together, it's the root. So I used to focus on having huge, big, leafy plants to try and carry the weight of the animal, but actually it's nothing to do with the plant stem and leaf. It's the biomass that the plant has underneath it that does all the good. So the best thing for biomass underneath is an old pasture. So we've been using old pasture for the last 2 years, which is a lot more successful. So it just seems they seem to carry on it better, but also it takes them longer to graze it. So they're not, with the cover crops, we found that they were finished by midday, and then they would spend the whole rest of the time plodging around thinking they want some more, because it's very high feed value, but not much bulk.
And they probably got absolutely perfect poos on the old stuff.
Yeah, on the old stuff. Yeah. The poos are
Perfect.
perfect poos. Perfect
Yeah.
poos.
So it's just going back to your rest, like your average, how many days rest the fields are having. What would it be?
So for the winter grazing, we'll have everything shut up by 1st of August, ideally. This year was slightly different in terms of we shut it up, but there was nothing grew until September, just with the dry. So fields that were getting shut up on the 1st of August we're losing sort of 6 weeks grazing, and then stuff that was shut up on the 1st of July, because obviously it's a big area. You know, some of it you'll graze on the 1st of July and not be back till you go back for winter grazing. So they were losing, well, 10 weeks of grazing really, because you were losing all of July, all of August and September before you really saw that regrowth come. So that was difficult to. I would never have experience of how to manage that maybe this year. So I think in hindsight, we probably should just shut them in a dry field and hay them or something like that, you know, just to save the grass for later on that we had. But possibly naivety and a bit of stubbornness, I thought we'll just keep going, and it's worked out all right. It just could have probably been managed better on my behalf, I think. So,
and financially, have you? Obviously, you'll be saving a lot with them being in for such a short time.
Yeah.
Have you got a figure on that, or you just know?
I think when we were doing it a few years ago, I think it cost us about £550 to £600 a year for a cow. I think I've got that down to near 300 now. So we can afford to take a lot less for the calf, and also I think we're probably getting more calves on the ground. So again, it's this thing of some of the arable, like with the arable, you can push for the absolute top price of everything, or you can look to get the margin that's going to give you the best going forwards. And I think I've kind of veered much more towards margin. I mean, I used to love showing cattle, but it didn't leave me the best margin, so I couldn't really justify continuing to do it like that. So
and do you tend to sell as wean calves or stronger stores?
I sell them at 6 months old straight off the cow. So we actually still calf creep we still creep the calves, because the men that buy off us at 6 months old want animals who know what feed is, so they won't get checked when they come off the cow, and then get checked with the diet, change the diet as well. So having discussed it with them, they'd still want us to introduce feed to the animals, so that they know what's happening when they come off the cow. So we created a couple. Again, it was the man who led me on, the contractor bloke very early on, who sort of let me pick his brains years ago. He had an idea and said, why don't you put some skids on like the skids off a mower, off the bottom of a mower. So he welded those onto the calf kit for us with a chain, and then a couple of big long skid bars along the bottom, and we can just hook it onto the bike and drag it to the next sort of plot. So we do that, and again, he wasn't very impressed to see us feeding animals, but at the minute, I think the way the market is, it pays to at the minute. And again, I'm not too dogmatic about the whole thing. At the end of the day, we're still here to make money. Well, the whole point of it is we have to make money. We can do all the good in the world we want, but it's no point in doing that if we're going to go bust after 6 months. So at the minute, it pays to do this. So we'll continue to do it until the market dictates we don't. But it doesn't look like it's going to do that anytime soon, much to it dumbfounds me, but that's the way the market is. So that's what we sort of have to move towards.
There's just a couple of questions on the cattle side. So do you, quick one, are the cows mobbed grazed as in one mob, or are you running them as a couple of groups?
Well, we've got the A69 splits our land kind of 2/3 and a third. So we have the main mob of cows down on the bigger chunk of land at the bottom, but then we run a separate mob up on the top of the 69, up on the other side of the 69, because it's not feasible to be walking cattle over the road, and it's not feasible to be bringing back and forwards 100 and whatever head of cattle twice or thrice a year. So we just essentially set our number up on the top, and both batches in this state. But it's 2 mobs at the minute, or 2 mobs this year, and then the sheep in 1 mob. So.
And the sheep mob, are they but with the cows at certain? I suppose it varies.
We've done.
Move a bit.
I think I've discussed this to you before, is that the sheep are very much. The sheep are different to manage than the cattle, because the cattle will sweep up everything and they're not selective. The sheep are very selective and picky eaters. So we've tried various ways of what the best way to manage them is, and I think we've come to the conclusion that probably letting them have the pick of the food in front of the cows the day before the cows, so they can go in and have 20% and pick whatever they want, and the cows will just come in and sweep up afterwards, is probably the best way to do it. But it does create a lot of work doing that. So we're still, as a team here at this end, trying to decide what our best way to do this for work-life balance, but also a performance. We did experiment with the 21-day rotational grazing, and the sheep did exceptionally well on that. But I always describe it as when the performance of the sheep goes up, performance of the soil comes right back. And then if you check it the other way and go for the soil, you find the sheep performance will go. So it's trying to find that middle ground. We had a GS4 herbal lay. We have a lot of GS4 herbal lays. So we had 2 fields side by side. We tried one as a rotationally grazed 21-day, and absolutely buckled the herbs and the clovers out of it by the end of the cloves we wanted, shall we say, the legumes we wanted by then. There was no bird switch or left or anything. So we found that the best thing to do is to try and let the sheep be selective over bigger, more mature crops, and let them just pick the little bits they do want, and then mop up with the cattle afterwards. But that, and again, in itself can create issues with stems running between the sheep's feet and stuff like that. So it's just trying to find a happy place.
Because when we were chatting with Greg, just dropped that into the conversation, but in terms of that idea of selecting animals or sheep on those sort of systems, doing a bit like you said before, we're trying to get sheep to fit the system we want them to be in, rather than selecting sheep that do well on those systems.
Yeah,
we're not quite there yet, are we, in terms of sheep that are designed to run on more mob type systems?
I think that there's not people selling that side of sheep yet, but I think you can very swiftly breed into them. So this year just gone, when we did on the cover crops, winter on the cover crops, we had still the full spectrum of livestock, of sheep, sorry. So we had the mules that we used to be our base flock, right up to so we're in Innovis sheep now, forage reared Innovis sheep. So we find that they carry their condition a lot better than I'm going to say regular sheep, but that's probably not the right word, but conventionally managed sheep. So this year we had a bit of a problem where we had 600 in the mob, and the mules were struggling with the way we were doing it, and the Innovis bred sheep, the Abatexes, actually started getting too fit. So we started skirting out the bottom ones of the mules, lambing them in a different sort of system, and then marking them, and they're gone. If they won't fit our system, they can't stay. And it meant now we've got less of them that won't manage the system. This year, I hope that we'll be able to just pull those other ones back slightly, because the lambs start to get too big on those. So if we can sort of keep the condition off them slightly better without worrying about trying to let the mules keep up with them, I think we'll hopefully find that sheep that slightly suits our system better again. And then again, if anything doesn't sit in the system, we'll get a red mark and it's gone. So
and are you aiming to finish your lambs or selling them stalls, or a mixture of both?
Well, we've made a right hash of it this year, because we, for the last 4 years, have pretty much finished everything on grass without any feed. Now we've started to think in July we're getting pretty short of regrowth here, and we discussed whether we should sell some in the store for the first time in years. But I think maybe a little bit of pride and a little bit of hope that things would just come good. And we thought, no, we'll just bash on. We had plenty, we got loads of feed. So we said, if we have to feed them, we'll feed them. And we'll just, so now we have a shed full of lambs getting fed, which goes pretty much against everything we want to do. But we will finish them all again. But for right or wrong, we would have been better off selling them in July, probably in the store. But it's easy to say that in hindsight. And I think what the one thing with this system is that you've got to look to protect the grazing when it matters. So we brought the lambs in and started feeding them, but we had plenty of grass still outside. It's just that was for other things. So if you sacrifice that grazing grass that's for your use, they call it cascading effects or compounding effects. So if you make a decision, it will be either cascading or compounding. Compounding meaning you've made a good decision, it's going to keep, and it'll have a roll-on effect in a good manner. If it's cascading, you make a bad decision, it starts going down, and there will be knock-on effects all the way through with that. So we found that that was definitely a cascading decision, whereby we kept them. They ate more grass than we wanted in the back end before we made the decision to bring them in, and then we're now feeding them at probably a loss, if we're being brutally honest about it. But again, it's nothing goes right all the time, but we are hopefully slightly more resilient to making errors because we have those low margins, those low input costs, and working with hopefully good margins to begin with. So
and I suppose the challenge, particularly with sheep, I remember listening to a webinar, and this was with GS4 built in as well, so the payment of GS4, but they and breeding sales, so there's compounding happening there. But in terms of the ability to get £1,000 a hectare, would be £1,000 a hectare in terms of margin. So, and that's doing it. And sheep, we've always had this discussion of how sheep fit in this regenerative, and by that we mean tall grass grazing system. But actually, as you say, where is this sweet spot between a proportion of your land being managed to maximize sheep performance, and then it moves almost back into a rotation where it's sort of healed by cattle? So it's sort of like, it's the idea of how you might put land in 2 years into arable. It's like a cash crop, isn't it? And then you return it to grass to build it back up again. A similar principle could be applied to a sheep type rotation.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, I mean, we've toyed with this year whether we'll, again, like I said before, we haven't quite decided how best to do it. But we have toyed that we know we'll have 40 acres of GS4 coming out and going into arable. So hypothetically, and we haven't decided whether we'll do this or not, hypothetically, could we rotationally graze that 40 acres, knowing that it will damage the plants beyond, they won't survive, the herbs and whatnot won't survive. But if we're going to spray that out anyway, is that the worst thing to do in the world? That's a decision we haven't quite made yet, but I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't do that. But again, we're not saying things are off limits. Anything works if it works for you and your business, and it has to work. Then it's okay to do in my eyes. But it's finding that balance between, is it too detrimental for the soil to justify doing? Because the soil's the key at the minute. Everything has to make sure that the soil comes back out of this all right at the end of it, sort of thing. So,
and Stuart, does it's tenanted farm, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
And your landlady,
Yeah.
Do they care about the soil as much as you?
Well, we probably had quite an inexperienced relationship with them from my point of view, where we hadn't spoken to them much and stuff. But then I probably approached them about 3 years ago and sort of said, look, this is what we're doing, just so you know, just so you're aware. And they've really sort of taken to it. They've been really supportive of it, and they're dead interactive with it now and interested in what's going on. And I think that's possibly as a tenant. And I think I blame the landlords and agents for this, is that the sort of bit of a them and us sort of thing sometimes gets created. And I don't think either landlords or tenants really want that. It's just that that's sort of the stand. And I engaging with the landlord more, we found it really rewarding, hopefully on both sides. And they're very supportive of it now, so it's been really nice. So.
There's just a couple of questions on the sheep side. One is, do you have a maximum group size that you run your sheep at?
Not necessarily, no. Just because we only have about 650 here at home. So we'll bring them all back from the other land. So the 650 here, then they'll be in a mob until maybe a month before scanning. Then we'll split them up into sort of maybe 2 mobs to try and we'll probably pull the singles off and try and pull them down a bit, and leave the 2s and 3s together. So no, there's no limit. I suppose it's what you think you can handle in the handling system and how much you're comfortable with. We did, again, this is a sort of as a family, I was all for the 650 straight away, and everyone else wanted to split them up and sort of let's ease into it sort of thing, which I can understand because it's quite a big mob to have to deal with. But when I was moving 3 mobs every day, it sharp makes you think, just get this into 1 mob and let's get on with it. So yeah, there's not much more work to moving 600 sheep than there is 200 sheep, because you're still putting up a fence to make it, you know, you're still putting 1 cross fence up, and you're still lifting the fence to let them go through, but you just stand there for a couple more minutes while they all run through, rather than just 200. So the bigger the mob, the better in my eyes, but you have to have the right stock to adapt to that sort of size of mob.
And you've got, Jean, in terms of, I suppose it's a bit like Nick, in terms of your cattle ratio would be higher than your sheep, wouldn't it, as a proportion in terms of stocking rate? Do you see the cattle going up as you've improved your wintering system, or reducing your wintering costs? Do you mean there's sort of a trend on certain farms, once they've nailed the how to winter suck the cows cheaply, they then push the cow numbers up, and the sheep that can be a bit of a pain in the arse reduce number wise. Do you see that happening as well, or is there things to be done around finishing or growing on calves a bit more? Or
I would, at the minute we're still selling the calves at 6 months old, and I think we'll continue to do that while the market dictates we do. But if the market suddenly disappeared for that, then we needed to finish the cattle. I would envisage that we'll just start finishing the cattle, running them on, and then finishing them the following year. We have about a 70 to 30% ratio with cattle to sheep. I think personally with regenerative farming, you need to have a higher proportion of cattle than you do sheep. I'm not saying you can't, but I think to make life slightly easier and allow for mopping up with the cows just to sweep up and stuff like that, it's easier when there's more cattle than sheep. I think long term, if it was my decision, there'd be no sheep, but that's nothing to do with the sheep. That's just my personal opinion with sheep. That's nothing to do with how regeneratively they're farmed. It's just I've always been a cattle man and an arable man, so the sheep's always been a bit of a side view for me. But I would say that that's the opposite with the rest of the team. They all love the sheep, so sheep will not ever disappear from our system, sadly. But if it was my choice, they probably would. So.
Liz, are we going to finish these questions? Are we going to get through them all?
Yeah, hopefully. So, I suppose the only thing about your herbal laying sheep in terms of considering widening that rotation, I mean, if you're on a 21 day on herbal lays, whether you widen that up to 40+ days, you might see some benefit from a herb protection.
But for me, you mean, yeah. I think we did the 21 days as an experiment, because that was what a lot of, and I'd refer to them as performance men sort of use their base sort of 21-day rotation, and they're very, very, very good at what they do. The far superior grazers than I am, but they do that in a way that is high time and high workload sort of thing. I think a lot of it is, and it's very hard on demanding on the soil. So I tend to veer away from that, but I would think if we went to a 42-day rotation with the herbal layers, it would be better for them. So.
And then there's just a question back to your deferred grazing. So with deferred grazing, do you find the grass dies off over time? Have you found with regen management, do you find the deferred grass lasts longer as it's more diverse than arguably healthier soils?
Yeah, so and I'm going to deviate, like we went to GS4 and I thought it was been a really clever bugger by putting in really high production ryegrasses when we started, and then loads of red clover, loads of, you know, all the things that everyone told me was high performance stuff. And then what I found was that all of our grass came at one point of the year. So we had no grass, loads of grass, and then no grass again, because all that stuff packed in. So we've actually changed our GS4s, for example, and I'm maybe not talking about this here, but for the GS4s, we've changed that where we now put in loads of cocksfoots and grasses that are not bred under a fertilizer situation. So with the variation we're putting now, our grazing season will never hit that huge peak, but it starts sooner and it runs a lot longer. So we're sort of spreading out that grazing season now, just by the different species that's in it. So for the deferred stuff, it is dying off a little bit. There's definitely that white grass standing there, but there's also an awful lot of green stuff in there as well. And that's just the different grasses will come to the fore at different times of the year. So the diversity is crucial in what we're trying to do, because it means that we have that spread out grazing rather than the big bulk. You know, if you're a dairy farmer and you're making a big crop, you want all your grass to come at once so you can get it in the pit, and that's what we used to do, but we don't want to do that anymore. So we've had to change that again to tinker with it, sort of thing. So
yeah, and as you say, it can be highly affected by nitrogen regime, can't it? But it can push that peak up a lot higher than it needs to be. There was a question. It was sort of linking back to your fungal sort of applicate or bacterial microbe application to grassland, and the question that you don't apply it to your grassland. So it was, you're applying it to your arable, you're not applying it to your grassland.
Yeah.
Do you think you should be lifting your fungal levels in grass? Are you happy with them? Have you measured them? What are you thinking about that bacteria fungi ratio in the grassland?
I would imagine that it's bacterially dominated still, because it'll take a while to fix that, or for that to balance itself back out. But I still think that mob grazing correctly will bring far more benefits than trying to force it with a spray or fungally dominated spray, if that makes sense. I think that if you manage it, it's like we've got a grassland sward lifter, you know. Now, I've only used it the first couple of years we got it, but my intention was to use it, and when I use it, that wants to be the last time we use it. But the only time that we can use it, the only point in using it is if it will be the last time. So when we use it, the only benefit will come if you change your practices to allow to fix the soil the right way. So using it once, it's like putting a plaster over it. You fix it once as a thing, but if you continue doing all the bad stuff, you'll then necessitate and you'll have to use that again in the future. So we work on the principle that if we're using it, it wants to be the last time we're using it. So it's the same with the mob grazing. I mean, we could spray all this stuff on, but I think the mob grazing is faster and works better. And if we continue to do that, we shouldn't have an issue going forward anyway. So that's my take on it.
Last couple quick fire questions. Did the cocksfoot continue to grow in the drought this summer?
Yes.
Thanks.
Liz, make a question up. Make a question up. What's your favourite?
Said it was quick fire.
It was close questions. So when you put your anaerobic microbes in the FOM, do you ensile it? Think bokashi, and do you use that as within your crop nutrition? So how do you use your farmyard manure?
Yeah, so the anaerobic bacteria goes on. Sometimes I put it on just before bed up in the shed, so it's just on the bottom of the shed. If I've got time, sometimes I just spray it on the muck heap, mix it in a bit. Again, it's one of those things that's costing me so little. I don't mind that maybe I'm not using it 100% correctly all the time, because it will, you know, bokashi's fantastic by all accounts, but it takes quite a bit of time and effort and pulling plastic sheets over and stuff, and I'm not really into making more work. So I'll spray it on willy-nilly it's not the end of the world if I lose some of those bacteria because they're not quite sitting in the right place or something like that, or it doesn't matter. So we work on the principle that if we take off from a field, we'll put something back on in the form of muck. So if we silage, we used to do 100 acres of silage, but we had nearly a third, no more. We had about half the silage pit left this year, so we've only done 37 acres of silage this year. So the silage contracting bill's gone down, and we then have muck to go on that we're putting less muck on because we've taken less off each field. So if you can get into a system where it's sort of cyclical within the field, so it's just cycling itself around, the idea of putting more muck on will be good. But if you don't need to do that, we just don't do that. We just, as long as we're happy the field's performing, everything that's in that field hopefully is there, and we're not doing anything that's going to affect levels or reduce pHs or anything like that. If we're managing it this, hopefully what we perceive to be right, then we should just let that field go forevermore by itself. So yeah, muck goes on where we've taken stuff off, essentially.
Last question: have your vet and med costs reduced with this management?
Yes, more so with interventions in terms of cesareans and stuff like that. We still run a very high health farm, so we were so that in itself comes with some inherent costs of, you know, vaccinations and stuff, and TB testing, sorry, Yoni's testing and stuff like that. So we do a lot of testing rather than medication. So our worming bills, so we only worm the yows once a year now. We used to routinely worm them quite a lot. We worm the cattle once a year, but only when they're in the shed, so it's not detrimental to the soil. We used to worm them frequently, and we don't worm lambs really. We'll probably worm them once or twice this year, maybe max. So we're not routinely doing anything anymore. So the applications have gone down, but probably the testing and health checking is the same as it was, because we want to stay a high health farm. So but we have seen massive amounts of dung beetles now, and I never ever thought I'd be the person that enjoyed looking in shit at dung beetles, but we have seen a lot of dung beetles. In fact, we had a dung beetle Armageddon this year because I'd left a molasses bucket out, which was half full, but then all the dung beetles got attracted into it, and there would have been thousands of enormous dung beetles dead in this bucket. So there's a lesson: never do that again. So,
I'm not sure that's a positive way to end. Yeah.
No, well, I'm just thinking,
but
Mac,
before the drowning, it could be an important way to capture dung beetles and relocate them. You took it too far.
I don't know why they were so attracted to it, but they obviously
it's sugar.
Possibly, yeah. But we are seeing enormous dung beetles now, and it is good. So,
oh, it's amazing.
Here's a positive one for you to finish with. Someone told me those big dung beetles will tunnel a meter down. So if they're going a meter down, they're doing all the work for me rather than me having to go in and do stuff. So
Matt Griffin has just said, what is you're not on Twitter. Are you on Twitter?
No, I'm on Instagram.
Yeah, so we need to encourage Stuart to be more out there on Instagram, and I think he needs a YouTube channel.
You declare that to be the case for everybody, though.
Well, no, don't you think he's blooming magic? I just had a message from someone on the call saying that he's awesome, honest, and canny. And curious as well.
Curious?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That means you want to know stuff.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Have
I got time for one question? Liz, I know we're late. Yeah. But if you could, if you were a farming government person, what can you think of? What would there be one policy or one thing that you would make or introduce?
I think the idea that, so within the countryside, there's a few things that make mob grazing and stuff sort of very difficult and unappealing. So within countryside stewardship, there's this weird thing written in that you shouldn't graze at a certain livestock units per hectare. So we've had them come and ask, and I mean, the guy came and inspected us, and he said, well, you can see everything's like really healthy and good. You know, there's no issues, but he said obviously there's a lot more livestock in there, and there was, you know, the gates open so they have access. If they wanted to get out, they could have accessed 100 acres. They could have walked over, but there's a weird thing in there that they don't want your livestock grazing much, and they don't want that to be a thing. But I think that they just have to let farmers farm in a way that is correct, especially if they can see it's going well. You need to just take those red tapes off and let people do it.
So they don't understand the mob effect, do they?
No, not at the minute, but I think they're getting there. Well, I met Janet Hughes at the Northern Farming Conference, and she was going to come over to the farm at some point to see what's going on. So he was really sort of both intrigued and enthusiastic about it. So if we can get her to understand, I think that would be a big step. I also think they need to stop handing out, and this is terrible if some of you are going to disagree with this, stop handing out grants for enormous big infrastructure and muck handling facilities and stuff like that, because I get a lot of people will need to handle muck and house cattle at some point, but the idea that that's the way to encourage people to do it is possibly not correct. I don't think. I think it needs to be sort of look at whole farm solutions rather than just sticking up a great big shed or a muck midden, which is, you know.
Yeah,
I think the bigger discussions aren't happening alongside it, is it? It's just the solution is to just build a bigger one rather than actually think about how we could reduce it or think about systems to reduce.
So our sheds, apart from the lambs being in, our sheds are fairly empty until the cows come in. So we have enough cattle housing to house sort of, I don't know, upwards of 200 cattle, but we generally have very little in the sheds until the cows come back in. And it seems like a waste to have all the sheds doing nothing apart from for that sort of 2-month block, but that's the expensive bit. So it's better they are outside where they need to be rather than us having to pay to look after them. So yeah, sorry, that's probably not hugely helpful.
Well, I think it's good. I think just quickly on carbon calling, it's the 9th and 10th of September this year.
Yeah, and we are currently looking for we're in discussions with a southern venue to do one probably the week before the lead up to it. Yeah,
with someone else.
Same speakers. So we've got Jamie Alexander. I need to learn how to pronounce the surname before then. Coming over, so he's definitely at the Cumbrian one on the 9th and 10th, and then we're hoping to use him for a couple of days, either the few days before that weekend or the few days after. We haven't quite got there yet.
So thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Really, we've covered so much stuff. It's unbelievable. So, and loads of questions. So brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Too much. Thank you.
No, it's great, especially when you get onto your compost. I'm expecting a video on compost.
It's very dull. It's very dull looking at compost brewing.
We could have like a live stream on compost. That's what Nick wants.
I think you'd be a YouTube sensation with your milk tank and your fish.
Everyone could buy a milk tank.
But no, Liz, my take home is, well, I love the way that you've gone on those courses and you've learned new skills and kind of really gone for it in quite an academic and also practical way. That's my take home. I think sometimes here we kind of we're quite practical, but sometimes I'm not sure I understand the academia of it, which would help me.
I think in a slightly different curve on that though, my dad said to me numerous times, I'm too old to be learning all this. And I say to him, you don't have, as long as you understand the principles and can get on board with that, you don't need to understand the science behind why it works. As long as you accept that if you do it right, it will work. So those people who are thinking, I'd love to give it a go, but it sounds really complicated or complex or challenging. I think the idea that it can be if you let it be, or if you try and make it. Whereas if you just sort of accept that what we're doing is working, and you're happy to understand that you don't need to know all that science, just make it simple, keep it simple and do that, and it'll work.
And how much do you enjoy it?
We're missing at the moment is that infrastructure of people to, like, the allied industries are not there to help, are they? They're there to help with the conventional approaches or to sell stuff, but the advisors and all of that aren't upskilled enough. So the support network is relying on farmers. I don't know that, but farmers are talking to farmers or going on courses. It's power to your own elbow, very much so, isn't it? But there isn't. It's how you build some more support into some of that.
It's
Or
incredibly
demonstration activities or all of that just isn't there yet.
They won't want to support it because there's very little to sell into it, and that's probably the difficulty of it, but also the beauty of it, that you don't have to buy stuff to make it work. You can just set off with an electric fence and the job's good if you want to do it like that.
But the independence is important, isn't it? But then there's a whole different, sort of wider conversation in terms of where does that, like, people like me rock up and have a chat, but I have to, the payment comes from somewhere, doesn't it? It doesn't come from me selling stuff, but it comes from, so it's how people value that information as well. But
then, as we touched on before there, I think with that policymaker and a DEFRA thing, that would be money well spent to educate people on how. I mean, if you go to the unis now, they're still teaching the conventional mindset. So, and that in itself is criminal, because they're still teaching people that they know the ideology of a broken system. So, if one thing they could do would be to educate people in a way that is beneficial for the environment, and so I'm trying to do is food production and beneficial to the environment. This bit makes me the money, and this bit's a happy sort of sideshow with it. But if they could get that rolled out on the masses to show people, that's far more beneficial than have some money for a shed, or education is far more powerful.
Yeah, and that part of education is about having a range of views, isn't it, rather than the doctrine according to. That's
possibly the
challenge.
problem.
So it's not that we might not need to learn. We need to learn all sorts. We just need to learn a wider selection of systems, rather than this is how you do it.
Yeah.
You could do it like this if you wanted, or you could do it like that. It's the openness or the flexibility of doing it in a different way.
Yeah. But I think, like you said before, there's no access to this sort of thing bar going out and hunting it yourself. There's no one, and that's difficult to navigate at times. So
definitely. But thanks again, Stuart. We're just conscious of time. So my take home, I like this idea, the cascading compounding. I think that was this idea that decisions the consequence of decisions are both positive and negative. So I thought that was quite an interesting way of explaining that. And this idea is just it's an element of bravery, and you just got to try it, see what happens. But that generally comes from a place of positivity, and not necessarily, I'm not happiness, but it's coming from a confidence place, isn't it? And a lot of people aren't feeling that confident at the moment, I suppose.
But you kind of, Stuart, you're giving off the vibes that this really floats your boat and you love it.
Absolutely. I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. But at the start there, a lot of it's just a bit of blind optimism, and you hope it'll work. And there's a little bit of a snowball effect in terms of as well, that if you get something, you try something that works, you think, well, I'm a bit more confident to do something that was slightly more out there the next time, and then it just sort of follows on from there. But I definitely wouldn't advocate just cutting the fertilizer and not telling the team. I think that just makes it slightly naughty.
Well, needs must some days.
Sometimes, yeah.
So I'm looking forward to photos on Instagram of you going into a forest tomorrow to dig some soil up.
So just tell me again, I need an oak tree and a
pine tree
in the middle, and then I dig in the middle. Okay.
Somewhere in the middle, and you'll get about a 1-to-1 ratio if you're lucky.
Okay.
I look forward to it. Thanks again, Stuart.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thank
everybody
you
for the
so much.
questions.
Thanks everyone.
the
Thanks for showing interest.
The recording will be up on the channel hopefully tomorrow, but I'll send a link round. But thanks everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.